Hey everyone. So it was just such a beautiful day. I decided that I needed to do a devotional out here. So there is this story in Acts chapter 16 that tells the story of the founding or the starting of the church in Philippi. And it's a really interesting story because the church in Philippi begins a little bit differently, I guess, than some of the other churches, because when Paul journeyed with Silas to Philippi, when he gets there, there's no synagogue there, which means they probably did not have enough Jewish males for them to start a synagogue, because you had to have so many there. So Paul does the next best thing, and he goes to a place by the river where he begins to speak to those who come to the river in a place that they call like a place of prayer. And he meets this woman who's there. She's a very wealthy woman. She's a dealer in purple. Her name's Lydia. And she seems to be what begins that church. Lydia invites Paul and Silas and the others who may have been traveling with him to come to her house, and they start what is probably a house church right there. But as the story continues, something really interesting happens, and Paul ends up getting himself into trouble. So Acts chapter 16, beginning at verse 16, it says this. One day as now Luke is writing this, so it could be Luke and Paul and Silas that he's talking about here, but he says, one day as we were going to the place of prayer, we met a slave girl who had the spirit of divination and brought her owners a great deal of money by fortune telling. While she followed Paul and us, she would cry out, "These men are slaves of the Most High God who proclaim to you a way of salvation." She kept doing this for many days. But Paul, very much annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, "I order you in the name of Jesus to come out of her." And it came out of her that very hour. But when the owners saw that their hope for making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the authorities. When they had brought them before the magistrates, they said, "These men are disturbing our city. They are Jews, and they are advocating customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to adopt or observe." The crowd joined attacking them, and the magistrates had them whipped, their clothing and whipped and stripped of their clothing, and ordered them to be beaten with rods. After they had been given a severe flogging, they threw them into prison and ordered the jailer to keep them secure. Following these instructions, he put them in the innermost cell and fastened their feet in the stocks. That's an interesting story, isn't it? In fact, the title, now this isn't really biblical, this is just what the editors have put in here, but the title of this little section is called Paul and Silas in Prison. And that's true, that's what happened. Paul and Silas, these great leaders, are thrown into prison. Why? Because they disrupted the economy. You see, they took away a way for people to make money, and because they had disrupted the economy, they were thrown into prison. And that's the story, right? Except as I read that story, I wonder to myself, what happened to the slave girl? I mean, think about that for a minute. The story focuses on Paul and Silas, who are the heroes of the story, I guess you could say, because they were the ones that came in and they were preaching the gospel and they were doing all this wonderful stuff. And Paul took the spirit of divination out of this young girl. They're the heroes of the story. And then you see the villains of the story, those who want to shut them down and throw them into prison. And we see this whole story about how because the economy was disrupted, they're all up in arms, right? And you know what happens? This slave girl gets lost in the hero story and those who are trying to protect the economy at all costs. In reality, what you have in this story is a young girl who is being exploited. And she was given her life back, and we have no idea what happened to her after that. Because sometimes that's where our focus is. Our focus is on the hero of the stories. Our focus might be on those things that help or hurt our economy and how it affects us. And that's really where the focus of most of our stories come in. But you know what? What happens in this story is there's a young slave girl that gets lost. And my hope and my prayer is, as some scholars have maybe thought, is that this young girl became a part of that church in Philippi, and she was able to grow in this experience of knowing who this Jesus was, this person by whom Paul had the authority to do what he did. My hope is that this girl, this young girl who had been treated as a slave and a commodity and a way to make money, my hope and my prayer is that she found a home in the church, but we don't know if that happened to her. And my fear is maybe she just wandered off and got lost in the crowd. We can't let that happen. We cannot let that happen. That is not the way the gospel is supposed to work. What should have happened in this story is we should hear what happens to that young slave girl. See, eventually, Paul and Silas, they get out of the prison and they go on their way and they do their next place of ministry. But what we should have heard in this story was how Paul and Silas then went and found that young slave girl, and they said to her, "Daughter, you are loved by Jesus the Christ. You are a part of our community and a part of our family." But that at least doesn't get recorded if that happened. And that's sometimes a mistake we make as people in the church. There are those who need to know the power of Jesus and the love of Christ, but because they're not a part of the hero story or a part of the people that get the focus, they just get lost. And because they were the reason the economy fell apart for these people that owned her, well, she's forgotten. She's unimportant. But to Christ, to God, to the one who showed the love of God, to Jesus, she's probably the most important person in this whole story. Her life was given back to her. Or so we hope. So we don't have young slave girls around us. At least if we do, they're invisible to us. But maybe we know someone that has been marginalized for whatever reason, that needs not just a hero to rescue them, but really needs someone to love them and bring them into the community of faith. I don't know who that might be for you, but I'm going to start looking. At least for me. Thank y'all.